What I'm about to share is one of the last memories I still have from my early teenage years, and unfortunately, it's not a pleasant one. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's the most traumatic thing I've ever experienced. Even now, years later, it still sends a chill down my spine whenever I think about it. During middle school, I didn't have many friends. I was a bit of an odd kid, and the few friends I did have were just as unusual as me. We were a small group, 4 of us to be exact: Ryan, Eric, Leo, and me. Back then, we were inseparable, always together, sharing similar interests and inside jokes. At that age, it felt like our friendship would last forever. But looking back, I realize now that Eric and I had already started drifting away from Ryan and Leo. We didn't talk about it, but the distance between us was there. Then came the summer when Ryan invited us on a week-long trip to Washington State. His family had a summer cabin on an island in the San Juan Islands. Until then, none of us even knew Ryan's family had a place like that. His parents were always private and secretive, and for reasons I didn't understand at the time, they didn't talk about the cabin much. It was like it didn't exist until Ryan invited us. His family, in general, had always seemed a little off, but that's another story. The drive to Washington was long, unbearably long. I had caught a cold just before the trip and was sneezing non-stop the entire ride. I could tell it was annoying Ryan's dad. He was one of those obsessive germaphobes, constantly wiping things down and freaking out over the smallest mess. Every time he glanced back at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowed in irritation. I was already feeling sick and uncomfortable, and that only made it worse. To top it off, Leo and I spent half the ride bickering over something trivial. I don't even remember what it was about, but we often got into petty arguments like that. Eventually, we reached the ferry that would take us to the island. Despite the tension in the car, that part of the trip was actually fun. We drove onto the ferry, and I remember being excited as the boat carried us across the water to the island. It felt like a real adventure back then. Ryan's summer cabin was small but beautiful. It sat on a quiet stretch of the island, surrounded by trees and overlooking the water. The moment I stepped inside, though, I felt something strange. It's hard to describe, but it was like the cabin didn't quite belong in this world. The air inside felt heavy, almost like it was pressing down on me. It was as if time slowed down when you were in there, and the cabin itself seemed to exist in some kind of dreamlike state. I still can't put my finger on it, but it was unsettling. The island itself was equally strange. It was one of those small, isolated places where everyone knew everyone. Random people we passed on the street would recognize Ryan and wave, even though Ryan never mentioned that he knew anyone on the island. It gave the place an eerie sense of familiarity, like we were stepping into someone else's life for a week. We spent the first few days biking around the island, exploring every corner. At that age, it felt like pure freedom. No parents, no school, just the open road and the ocean surrounding us. But that's when things started to go wrong. On the second day, I noticed that my Seattle Sounders cap was missing. It was one of my most prized possessions. I was a huge soccer fan back then, and it was one of the few pieces of soccer merchandise I owned. I was devastated. Ryan tried to calm me down by suggesting that I might have left it at the beach, but I was almost certain I had brought it back with me. I felt panicked, upset, and irrationally angry at myself for losing it. I ended up crying to Ryan's dad about it, but he brushed me off, telling me that losing a hat wasn't a big deal and that I shouldn't let it ruin the trip. I didn't have much of a choice but to agree, even though it left a sour taste in my mouth. The next day, something even stranger happened. One of my pens went missing. Now, you have to understand, I was obsessed with pens at the time. I had a collection of them that I brought with me everywhere. So, losing one was more than just an inconvenience. It felt like a betrayal. I had no idea when it had disappeared, but Eric said he remembered seeing me holding it while we were biking earlier. The thought that I might have dropped it somewhere along the way devastated me. To me, losing that pen was like losing a piece of myself. But I wasn't about to cry in front of Ryan's dad again, so I pretended I was feeling sick and retreated to the bedroom to sulk. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m., unable to sleep. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, frustrated that I couldn't drift off, and then suddenly I heard it, whispering. Faint, barely audible, but definitely there. I froze, listening closely, trying to figure out where it was coming from. At first, I thought I might be dreaming, but no. The sound was real. The whispering was soft, like someone was trying desperately not to be heard. It sounded like it was coming from Leo's bed, which was across the room from mine, but I couldn't be sure. I lay there, my heart pounding in my chest, too afraid to move. I wanted to say something, to ask who was whispering and what they were saying, but fear kept my mouth shut. The whispering continued for what felt like an eternity. And then, nothing. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the bright morning sun. I tried to push the memory of the whispering out of my mind, convincing myself that I'd imagined it. Later that day, while we were playing in the yard, Leo excused himself to use the bathroom. He was gone for a while, but none of us thought much of it. Leo always took his time with everything. After a while, I happened to glance back at the cabin and did a double take. There, in one of the second-floor windows, was Leo, staring blankly down at us. For a moment, I thought nothing of it, until it hit me. Ryan's cabin didn't have a second-floor bathroom. I looked around to see if Ryan or Eric had noticed, but when I turned back to the window, Leo was gone. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something wasn't right, but I didn't say anything. The day passed in a blur, and by evening, Ryan's dad announced that he was taking us all out to dinner. I didn't want to go. I told them I wasn't feeling well again and stayed behind. Lying in bed that evening, I replayed the events of the past few days in my head. The missing cap, the stolen pen, the whispering, and now Leo's unsettling presence in that second-floor window. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. And then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I got out of bed and started going through Leo's things. What I found horrified me. My Seattle Sounders cap was stuffed at the bottom of Leo's bag. As I dug deeper, I found more of my missing belongings, things I hadn't even realized were gone. A toothbrush, a nail clipper, even a pair of my underwear. My stomach twisted in disgust. I was about to put everything back when something else caught my eye. His notebook. I shouldn't have opened it. Even now, I regret it. Inside were page after page of disturbing drawings, monsters, grotesque creatures, and violent, brutal images. People being run over by cars, stabbed, mutilated. The drawings were dark and twisted, and some had been sketched with such intensity that the pages were ripped. But the worst part, there were drawings of me. One page showed me tied to a cross, my legs missing. Another was covered with my name, written over and over in shaky, obsessive handwriting. Then I turned to the last page. My name was scrawled at the top, and beneath it were 4 words: "I'll do it tomorrow." Terror washed over me. I slammed the notebook shut and shoved it back into Leo's bag, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When the others returned from dinner, I pulled Ryan's dad aside and told him everything. At first, he didn't believe me. But when I showed him the notebook, his face went pale. He told me to put everything back the way I found it and not to say anything to the others. I didn't want to. I wanted to scream, to run, to get as far away from that cabin as possible. But he was the adult, and I had no choice but to listen. The next morning, Ryan's dad abruptly ended the trip, claiming there was a family emergency. As we packed our bags, I could feel Leo watching me. I didn't dare look at him. We left the island as quickly as possible, catching the first ferry back to the mainland. Ryan's dad dropped Leo off at his house first, and I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of relief when he was gone. On the ride home, Ryan's dad told me not to. Mention anything to my parents. He said he had spoken to Leo's parents and that it was best to keep things quiet. At first, I was furious. How could I stay silent about something so disturbing? But the exhaustion from the trip and the relief of finally being away from that nightmare made me agree, for the time being. I just wanted it to be over. When I got home, I couldn't hold it in. The moment I saw my mum, I broke down and told her everything. The missing items, the whispering, the terrifying notebook. Her face turned pale as I spoke, and I could tell she was just as disturbed as I had been. She immediately called the police and reported everything. It didn't take long for them to show up at our house, and I had to explain the whole story again. The next few days were a blur. The police launched an investigation and even contacted Ryan's family to question them about the trip. Ryan's dad was furious when he found out I had gone to the authorities. He called me and demanded that I retract my statement, claiming I was ruining the family's reputation. But there was no way I was backing down. Things escalated quickly. The police obtained a warrant and searched Leo's house. They found the notebook. And not just that, but other disturbing items, a collection of knives, more drawings, and even photographs. Some of the photos were of us from the trip, taken without us knowing. There were pictures of me sleeping, of Ryan and Eric playing outside, even one of Leo standing by the window, staring at us. The most horrifying discovery was a journal Leo had been keeping. Inside were detailed, violent fantasies about hurting me and others. It was beyond sickening. In the final entry, he wrote about his plan to finish what he started during the trip. The date on the entry: the day we left the island. Leo was arrested and taken into custody. His parents insisted they had no idea about any of this, and maybe they didn't. But something about the whole situation felt off, like there was more to the story that they weren't telling. Either way, I was just relieved that Leo was no longer a threat. The news of Leo's arrest spread quickly through our town. Everyone was in shock, especially Ryan and Eric. They couldn't believe that the person we had been friends with for years had been capable of something like this. I couldn't believe it either. It felt like I had stepped into a horror movie, one that I couldn't escape from. The aftermath wasn't easy. I had nightmares for months, constantly replaying the events of that trip in my head. The sight of Leo in the window, the whispers in the dark, the drawings of me mutilated, it all haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I hadn't found that notebook, something much worse could have happened. Even now, years later, the memories linger. I haven't spoken to Ryan or Eric since the arrest. Our friendship just couldn't survive the trauma we went through. They tried to move on, but for me, the scars run too deep. I've never gone back to the San Juan Islands, and I don't think I ever will. As for Leo, I've tried not to think about him. Last I heard, he was still in a psychiatric facility undergoing treatment. Part of me feels sorry for him, sorry for whatever drove him to such a dark place. But the other part of me is just grateful that he's locked away, where he can't hurt anyone. I still can't help but wonder, though, what if I hadn't found the notebook? What if I had ignored all the signs? The thought sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. This story is fresh in my mind because it happened just last week. Even as I write this, the whole experience still gives me chills. My extended family has always been a little strange. I won't go into all the details, but let's just say a lot of them are either obsessed with guns, avid hunters, or both. Most families take vacations in the summer, but my family? We prefer the dead of winter. Every year, the adults rent a large house somewhere remote for a week. It's always in the middle of nowhere, usually deep in the woods. This time, they chose a massive lodge in Montana. When I say lodge, it was more like a mansion. It had to be to fit all of us. Now here's where things start getting weird. My family has this tradition of playing bizarre games, many of which involve some form of shooting. The strangest one happens on the second to last night of the trip. Everyone suits up in winter gear and heads outside into the woods for a huge game of laser tag. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's just how it is with my family. My uncle Gregor is the one who takes it the most seriously. He's the one who created the laser tag set we use. It's no store-bought stuff either. It's some custom-made, high-tech gear. The rules are simple. It's every person for themselves. The last one tagged wins a cash prize and eternal bragging rights for the year. If no one is tagged by midnight, the prize is split among those left standing. Once you're tagged, you head back to the fire pit outside the house. And once the second to last person returns, everyone shoots into the air to let the last player know they've won. I had just turned 18, so this was the first year I was allowed to play. I was beyond excited, not even for the prize, but for the sheer thrill of it. As we were getting ready to head into the woods, Gregor explained how the equipment worked and reminded us to place our markers correctly to ensure fair play. Then, without warning, he bolted into the forest like a man possessed. One by one, my relatives took off in different directions, disappearing into the trees. I noticed that most of them ran uphill, so I decided to head downhill, thinking it would give me a better chance at survival. The snow on the ground made everything visible, despite the dark night surrounding us. I can't remember how many of us were playing, but it must have been at least 15, including my cousins and a few parents. I found a decent spot to catch my breath, a little perch overlooking the hill. I waited there, heart racing, trying to come up with a plan. After a while, I figured if I moved along the slope horizontally, I might be able to flank whoever was up there. I started walking, careful not to make too much noise. 15 minutes went by, and I had covered a decent distance, putting more space between me and the house. I figured I still had plenty of time before midnight, so I started climbing back up the hill. That's when I heard it, a faint crunch of snow behind me coming from the deeper part of the forest. I froze, then ducked behind a tree, praying that whoever was out there hadn't spotted me. After a few moments, I peered out from behind the tree and squinted into the darkness. Nothing. But then I saw it. Faint footprints leading to a large tree about 20 yards behind me. Someone was standing there, hidden from view, and yet they hadn't tagged me. Why not? I was out in the open, oblivious to their presence. They should have gotten me easily. Something felt wrong. I bolted up the hill, hoping to get out of range before they could fire. As I reached the top, I noticed another set of footprints off to my left. These were different. They came from deep within the forest, looped around, and led back into the trees. It was as if someone had been following me, flanking me from an even greater distance than I had gone. Before I could process it, I heard a soft thud behind me, like someone had fallen in the snow. I didn't wait around to investigate. I ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, back towards the house. I pulled out my phone. It was already past 11. How had an hour passed so quickly? As I ran, I stumbled across fresh footprints leading back toward the house. I picked up speed, hoping to catch someone off guard. Just ahead, I saw my cousin, Arlo, walking steadily, laser gun in hand. I crouched down, aimed my laser pistol, and fired at his marker. It blinked, signaling I had hit him. He slammed his fist against a tree in frustration, muttering something under his breath as he stomped back toward the house. Feeling a surge of adrenaline, I came up with a plan to outsmart whoever had been stalking me earlier. I sprinted ahead for a minute, then doubled back and hid behind a tree, leaving no obvious trail. I was confident I had outwitted them. But just as I settled into my hiding spot, my marker started blinking. I had been tagged. I was furious. The shot had come from the exact place I had just been. I stood up, expecting whoever had hit me to turn off their laser, but they didn't. The beam stayed trained on me, almost mocking me. Annoyed, I decided to confront whoever it was. I walked toward the beam of light, closing in on the source. As I got closer, I saw their hands gripping the gun, but the rest of their body was hidden behind a tree. And then I heard it, gunshots behind me. 3 shots rang out, making me jump. I froze. That meant the game was over. I must have been the last one tagged. But if I was the last person, who was the one stalking me? I stared at the beam of light still pointing at me. Slowly, the person holding the laser gun stepped out from behind the tree. It was a stranger. Worse, there were 2 of them, side by side. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I whipped around to see a man in a ski mask, holding a trash bag in one hand and a knife in the other. Our eyes met for a split second before he charged at me. Panic surged through me as I ditched my gear and sprinted for my life. I could hear all 3 of them chasing me, shouting in a language I couldn't understand. I ran as fast as I could, heart pounding, legs burning, terrified I would trip. They were gaining on me. Finally, through the trees, I saw the lights of the house. I screamed for help, my voice cracking, and just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw Gregor charging toward me with his rifle. He raised it and fired 3 shots into the air. The men chasing me stumbled, then turned and fled back into the woods. I collapsed at Gregor's feet, gasping for breath, and passed out right there in the snow. The next morning, the family gathered around as I recounted what had happened. My aunt explained she had dropped her laser gun in the snow, which must have been how those men got it. We reported everything to the police and the owners of the lodge. My cousin Arlo had tagged almost everyone before I got him, which explained his frustration. The adults tried following the footprints of the men who had chased me, but there were too many paths leading nowhere. They eventually gave up. That day passed in a blur, but the real shock came the next morning. I woke to the sound of shouting. Gregor was outside, screaming toward the woods. I ran downstairs and out the door to see what was happening. There, facing the house, stood a snowman. In its hand was my aunt's missing laser gun. Gregor fired several rounds into the snowman's head before storming back inside. It's been a week since then, and I'll update you if anything else happens. This experience is still fresh in my mind, mostly because it happened just last week. I still feel a little shaken up thinking about it. When I was in college, I could never afford those extravagant spring break trips to Cancun that most of the sorority and fraternity kids went on. Because of that, I spent my first 3 spring breaks on campus, which honestly wasn't that bad. But by the time my senior year rolled around, I realized it was probably my last chance to experience a real spring break vacation. Mexico was still out of the question though, since I had to pay for everything myself. That's when my girlfriend, Emma, found a pretty affordable Airbnb that sounded perfect for us. We decided to make it a couples retreat, so we invited her best friend, Jess, and her boyfriend, Max. We were all super excited because none of us had ever gone on a vacation together before. The Airbnb wasn't your typical spring break spot though. It was tucked away in a secluded, forested area near Big Bear Lake, California. There was a hot tub, a cozy fireplace, an old-school record player, and a deck for stargazing. It sounded like a dream escape. The place was about 3 hours from campus, so we had a nice, scenic drive to look forward to. Unfortunately, Max drove a tiny Fiat, which meant Jess and Emma had to squeeze into the back seat. Max was a bit touchy about his car, so any jokes about the cramped space set him off. Despite the tight quarters, we made the best of it. The drive was nice enough, and we arrived at the cabin around 8 p.m., by which time it was pitch dark. I can't lie, the cabin looked pretty eerie at night with no lights on. When I say it was in the middle of the woods, I mean it. The trees were so dense that you could barely see the one other house nearby. That first night was calm. We hung out by the fireplace, shared a bottle of wine, and played board games. We wanted to get in the hot tub, but Max wasn't in the mood and was acting weirdly pouty, so we skipped it. We all figured he was just dealing with something personal and didn't press him about it. The second night, things were different. We finally convinced Max to join us in the hot tub, and after a few drinks, everyone started loosening up. The hot tub was attached to the back of the house in a screened-in room. The walls were just mesh, so we could feel the night air and hear the sounds of the forest. We were playing a drinking game, music blasting, and laughing when suddenly a blinding flash of light lit up the entire spa area. It was so bright that if it had been raining, we would have assumed it was lightning. Everyone fell silent. I quickly shut off the music, and we all just stared at each other, unsure of what to say. My heart started racing. I slowly got out of the hot tub and walked onto the deck to check outside. The forest was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything. Then I heard it, a faint clicking sound coming from the woods. A few seconds later, I heard it again, but this time from another direction. Then a high-pitched whistling sound joined in. It was coming from all around us. Clicks and whistles from too many directions to count. I yelled for everyone to get inside, and they scrambled out of the hot tub and into the house. We huddled together in the living room, completely freaked out. At first, I thought maybe it was just a prank or something, so we didn't call the police right away. But then, out of nowhere, someone started banging on the front door. Jess and Emma were crying, so I told Max to call the cops while I grabbed the biggest knife I could find in the kitchen. I was ready to defend us if it came to that. Trying to sound intimidating, I yelled out that I had a gun, hoping to scare off whoever was outside. The banging stopped. Max said the police were on their way, but out here, in the middle of nowhere, there was no telling how long they'd take. We sat there in silence for what felt like forever. Just when I started thinking it was over, one of the living room windows shattered. Someone had thrown a rock through it. Emma and Jess screamed, and I yelled for everyone to run upstairs and lock themselves in one of the bedrooms. I stayed downstairs, knife in hand, preparing for the worst. But no one came through the window. I cautiously approached the shattered glass and noticed something strange. There was a piece of paper taped to the rock. Written in dark ink were the words, "Leave. You don't belong here." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The police arrived not long after that and searched the area. They didn't find anything, no signs of anyone in the woods, no clues, nothing. We didn't stick around to find out if whoever it was would come back. We packed up our things and left that night. The Airbnb host offered us a full refund but refused to talk about what had happened. My girlfriend is convinced there's something the owner wasn't telling us. Maybe she's right. It would explain why the place was so cheap to rent. Either way, I don't think I'll be using Airbnb again anytime soon.